for me to introduce this semester's Dean Family speakers, Dr. Christopher Freeburg and Dr. Michael Snediker. I just want to begin with a few acknowledgments. First of all, Wake Forest now sits on lands that were once a place of exchange for many indigenous peoples, Saur, Catawba, Cherokee, and Lumbee. And Wake Forest owes its existence in part to an endowment derived from the sale of 16 enslaved men, women, and children in May of 1860. And Wake Forest continues to grapple with the question of how to acknowledge and honor such debts. More immediately, I would like to acknowledge our debt to the Dean family for their generous support of literary scholarship. Thanks to their donation, the English department is very lucky to be able to host a series of lectures each year by leading scholars and writers in the fields of English studies. And over the years, it has brought to Wake Forest a wealth of brilliant talks, readings, and workshops by thinkers such as Lauren Berlant, Devaney Lucer, Gordon Huttner, Ivy Wilson, Dana Luciano, and many, many others. I would also like to thank very effusively all of my colleagues who worked to make this event possible: Judith Madera, who directs the Dean Family Speaker Series, Jefferson Holdridge, my department chair, our tireless former and current academic coordinators, Anna Willis, Gail Adams, and Reggie Brown, the department's wonderful graduate assistants, Maggie Wagner and Hannah Perry, and the staff from the library, bookstore, and catering who have set up tonight's event. When Judith Madera approached me last spring about planning a fall event for the Dean Family Series, she suggested that we might do something different and invite two scholars whose work is in dialogue in really compelling ways. And I immediately thought of what a delight it would be to hear Chris Freeburg and Michael Snediker together and in conversation. Both scholars of American literature, both utterly brilliant readers of Herman Melville's writing, Freeburg and Snediker are also aesthetic thinkers whose work offers some of the most complicated, complex, and productive answers I can think of to the question of what aesthetics matter to literary scholarship and literary history, both in the sense of which aesthetics become relevant and important, and in the sense of how aesthetics materialize abstract concepts, histories, persons, bodies, sensations. And while their interests converge on Herman Melville's experimental poetics, their methodologies and their interventions are really quite distinct. In Freeburg's books, Herman Melville and the Idea of Blackness, Black Aesthetics and the Interior Life, and Counterlife, Slavery After Resistance and Social Death, he has modeled methods of reading against and beyond determinate narratives of social death in the slavery's afterlives in order to discern what appears when critics cease to presuppose either total subjection, total objectification, and mastery on one side, or democratic resistance and liberation on the other side. And what appears, he's demonstrated in each of his books and articles, is the impossibility of mastery and the myriad forms of personhood and meaning that enslaved peoples generated for themselves. In Michael Snediker's books, Queer Optimism, Lyric Personhood, and Other Felicitous Persuasions, and Contingent Figure, Chronic Pain, and Queer Embodiment, he's modeled methods of reading against the melancholic affects of queer theory and the ontological assumptions of disability studies in order to attend closely to the presence of positive affects and the phenomenal aesthetics through which lyric personhood and figurative matter can be approached and approximated. For me, the work each of them has done with the aesthetics of figuration has been utterly indispensable to my thinking and writing about Herman Melville. From Chris Freeburg's study of the figure of blackness across Melville's writing, I learned to resist as false the binary split between the philosophical and the historical, and to see at once the ways in which figuration joins concept to matter. In the figure of blackness in Melville's writing, Freeburg locates not a phenotype, but a force that thwarts mastery and the social realities it supports and carries with it, quote, an inordinate historical, aesthetic, and philosophical possibility. From Michael Snediker's meticulous accounts of the most extravagant prose in Melville's Pierre, I learned to resist the drive to find characters or persons, where Melville instead provides figurative lavishness that is itself a force and a form of what Snediker calls transitional matter. Taken together, their work insists on the necessity and urgency of our attention to what and how aesthetics matter. Christopher Freeburg is the Presidential Humanities and Social Sciences Chair at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He is an award-winning author of 3 scholarly books and numerous articles, including Melville and the Idea of Blackness, Black Aesthetics and the Interior Life, and Counterlife. His book In Progress, Soul, A Brief History of Black Cultural Life, is the culmination of his life's work of teaching African-American history and culture from the church to hip-hop, from slavery to the present. He holds a BA from Xavier University of Louisiana, an MA from Stanford, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He's the recipient of numerous academic awards, fellowships, and titles, most recently University Scholar, Center for Advanced Study Associate, University Scholar, and Conrad Humanities Scholar, as well as the Henning Cohen Prize from the Melville Society in 2012, and his talk today is Counterlife. Michael Snediker is the author of Contingent Figure, Chronic Pain and Queer Embodiment, and Queer Optimism, Lyric Personhood, and Other Felicitous Persuasions. He is also the author of 2 books of poems, and if you are available tomorrow night, you can hear him read with Cole Swenson. His books of poems are titled The New York Editions and, delightfully, The Apartment of Tragic Appliances. His essays have appeared or are forthcoming in journals including Differences, ELH, the Henry James Review, Keep Harrell, as well as edited collections with Cambridge University Press, Duke University, and Oxford University Press. He is presently writing about object relations minus objects in the work of Lauren Berlant, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick in the Proustian scenes of Thoreau's journals. A fortunate recipient of residencies at both the James Merrill House and Yaddo, he's presently Professor of American Literature and Poetics at the University of Houston, and his talk today is titled Landscape as Ascesis, Hardy, Butler, Thoreau, and Others. Please join me in welcoming both of them, and I will invite Chris Freeburg to begin.
Really?
I don't know if the microphone is
microphone
on.
on? Do I need it? I could do it without too.
Yeah. Let me see what
I don't think it's on. I mean, I don't know if you said you could film it.
Now it's on. Oh, it's red.
Does that mean it's on?
Now it's on.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer, for that very great introduction. Makes me, I'm like, who's this person she's talking about? It's awesome. I want to meet him. It's been a great day so far, hanging out with Meredith and Jennifer and Michael and those. I've known Judith a long time and a great fan of her work, and so I'm glad you were instrumental in bringing me here. I'm in a weird place in my academic writing. I mean, I'm writing a trade book currently. It's called Soul, and so I'm in this place where I'm thinking a lot about like where I've been and where I'm going. So today is more of like a version of where I've been and how, and I'm just thinking about some of the through lines in my work. And I brought up the trade book because if you want to ask me about like what I'm writing now and how this relates, I'm happy to answer those questions. But this talk today is me kind of meditating on different pieces of my own work. And is it off still on? Going off?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a culmination of what I'm doing today. We can talk about more. I don't want to belabor the time because I know we both have to go and put people to sleep. So I retitled it called Babo's Wake, an Intellectual Journey. And I ended with Counterlife. So the Counterlife says, I didn't do a switcheroo on Jennifer. Herman Melville's Benito Cereno is one of my favorite stories. A New Englander, Massa Delano, discovers a wayward vessel off the coast of South America carrying a cargo of enslaved Africans. Delano tries to aid the ship. The enslaved Africans who wander the decks of the San Dominic ship appear mostly obedient, except for a few disruptions. One of the Africans, Babo, appears dutiful to the task of supporting Don Benito Cereno, the captain. Spoiler alert. If you haven't read the novella, the Africans have revolted and taken over the ship, and it is not until the very end of the book that the truth of the ship's revolt is revealed to Delano and Melville's audience. Melville refers to the head of the insurrection leader Babo as the hive of subtlety. Babo was willing to kill others and risk his life for freedom, but the whites who relied on his faithful servitude did not know that. Had Babo's enslavers had a real inkling of his thirst for freedom, they may have survived. In my book, Black Aesthetics in the Interior Life, I call the ongoing reality of not being able to know what someone is thinking, especially in moments where we most want to know, epistemic estrangement. And strangely, it is in these unbridgeable ontological difference where I locate humanity and personhood. The challenge of realizing that a significant part of what it means to be human lies in what we cannot know about someone is that it disturbs and unsettles any political promises based on the forms of certainty and knowing. One cannot get to otherwise or alternative ways of being or any tangible political freedom as we know it from irresolvable enigmas. In my work on Blackness in African American culture, I try to sit with these frustrating relationships. My late friend and mentor, Lauren Berlant, would advise me, Chris, have more patience for enigmas. In today's talk, I will examine how the Africans aboard the San Dominic vessel Embodiment Sereno remind us that in the very conditions we seek to master, we can be overthrown by unpredictable actions of people whose minds we cannot know nor predict fully. From Melville, I moved on to discuss three domestic workers, mammy figures, whose obedient reputations and predictable appearance point us toward an irresolvable subject-object distinctions that define a kind of black interiority. And finally, I conclude with a discussion about how the categories and types that we use to make sense of the social lives of enslaved Africans, too often arrest and limit the way we discuss the full range of the oppressed life in bondage. I pull these examinations together as a way of pointing to the through lines in my research. Across my writing, I find myself wrestling with different answers to the same question. How do we mine experiences of irreconcilable uncertainty without recourse to concrete political fulfillment? Babo's Hive of Subtlety. Reflecting on the idea of silence in Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, Dan McCall warns that critics like Michael Rogan should not attempt to politicize the story by turning Bartleby into Thoreau. While McCall narrows the idea of the political to overt resistance, I take his point to be that it is important, at least at first, to recognize the intensity of Bartleby's silent suffering and its effects. Can one say something similar about Benito Cereno's silent signs, the ship's enslaved Africans? Not that they eschew the political, but rather that any analysis that includes them will be more forcefully enriched by the literary ontological aspects that also define them. Undoubtedly, then, the silences in Benito Cereno do communicate, or else silence would not be an effective device for Melville. Yet silence is not an inundation of discourse, but rather a confrontation with which renders emblems, all meaning and articulations useless. The Africans are not actually the silence, but as emblems of blackness, they signify a conflict with what is ultimate silence conveys, its power of epistemic oblivion, and the social dissolution that Delano stands on the edge of, and Cereno embodies. Silence is another form of blankness, and blankness has its purpose in relation to the myriad of discourses Melville mediates throughout. One cannot produce political, linguistic, and historical affirmations and clarity without consulting what the silent signs, which Melville foregrounds, actually did to the reality of the Spaniards who owned them. To the reader and Delano, Cereno appeared unstrung, if not still more seriously affected, like some hypochondriac, and now with nervous suffering was almost worn to a skeleton. Melville designed Cereno to be unresponsive, stricken by cadaverous sullenness. Cereno borders on incoherence, and he seems deeply traumatized by the psychic violence of the revolt, and the memory of the bloodshed physically emaciates him. But the cause of the alleged mistreatment and ill manners stems from not only the revolt, but also the tragic loss of his dear friend, and the rehearsals of torture committed by the slaves. The actions of the slaves, their vibrant strivings for freedom, and the epitome of all that social life caused Cereno's anti-social disposition. Cereno's experience of the silent signs reenacts the profound disturbance of slave insurrection until he dies. Given Cereno and Aranda's experience, which constitutes the historical present of the San Dominic, Melville's meditation on silence in his novel Pierre encourages a reading altogether different from relying on political speech or African culture to make sense out of silence. So I put the Pierre in there for you. In Pierre, Melville writes the following about silence. All profound things and emotions of things are preceded by silence. Silence is the general consecration of the universe. Silence is the invisible laying on the divine pontiff's hands upon the world. Silence is at once the most harmless and the most awful thing in all of nature. It speaks of the reserved forces of fate. Silence is the voice of our God. Upon reading this passage, there can be no mistake that silence bespeaks a plethora of profundities to Melville to play upon the political silence ordered by antebellum sedition acts, which Maurice Lee emphasizes, or the disenfranchised voicelessness of actual slaves that Frederick Douglass lectures about, is telling historically and sociologically for slaves. These historical lamplights, however, do not attend to the impact of violence and alienation in the totalizing sense that Pierre refers to. It is certainly not an accident that enslaved Africans whose operates as silent signs share in these profundities. The question is how. Within the passage, Melville posits silence as the pretext of earthly phenomena. It is the nothingness of humans that is the original somethingness, posited as God. Melville characterizes humankind's relation to the silence as birthing existence and the movement of fate that can be both harmless and tragic. And this certainly speaks to different types of experiences, from wonderful bonds between people to the horrible reality of disturbing and unforeseen events in history. Yet there's another dimension that sheds light upon the foregoing reading of Benito Cereno. Realizing silence in this way is to confront the manifestation of an ultimate totality, pictured as endless gray, a blankness neither infinitely living or dead, but the all itself that inspires dread in whoever faces it. This inspired dread, the result of the confrontation with the void, emerges in the white's encounters with the signs of blackness. The enslaved Africans are not the void itself, but their blackness signifies what it's like to be forced to face it in the place where mastery unravels, as one experiences the contradictory field of knowable social conventions and the unknowable all. Cereno and Aranda's loss is all the most devastating towards symbolic violence. Silence dramatizes the stakes of blackness the slaves signify. The slave insurrection doubles as a result of whatever cannot be figured, rationalized, or conquered. And when this all confronts subjects, it can only come crashing in on them. The slaves embody this blackness in the history of the San Dominick. The Mammy within. One would think that it would be impossible to connect the leader of an insurrection aboard a slave ship to a mammy figure. But if epistemic estrangement is truly ontological as I've rendered it, then Mammy Jane from Charles Chestnut's 1896 novel, The Marrow of Tradition, also must have the capability of revealing what is compelling about how we think and experience what we cannot know within ourselves and our personalized social attachments. Mammy Jane loyally labors for the Carteret family of the old white Southern aristocrats. Is she an object or a thing? An instrument of whites' ideal mastership over black people? In some ways, she clearly is. It is equally apparent that her thoughts, practices, and behaviors, however loyal to the Carteret's interests, only make sense in personal terms. Bruno Latour could not have been more right when he argued that humans should not sit at the opposite pole of things. Relatedly, Bill Brown claimed things make us aware of the human. While things awaken unperceived as aspects of our humanity, I still believe that the powers of human identification never cause ontological ambiguity between people. That is, one never really confuses another person for something else under normative conditions. So while a person may not be a thing, a person can be possessed by thingness or thinghood. The thingness of a person stems from epistemic and psychological ambiguity between subjects. Kind of like me in this microphone, it's not working. Anyway, if one knows something else is a person, then one also knows he or she cannot know for certain what is in that person's head in a given moment or at all. This sense of epistemic disturbance magnifies the personal form. Brown's language about the distinction between objects and things can serve as an entry point to discuss the import of ontological difference that defines personal form, made evident by looking at the relationships between personal thought and expression, black racial difference, and objectification. Here I briefly address the mammy as a figure associated with a glaring contradiction, solely expressing her master's interests or a fierce independence. Mammy figurines of the Old South flourishes as commodities alongside the social reality of black maids, nurses, and servants all over the United States. This idea is epitomized in the corporate machinery of dolls that are made in the image of Aunt Jemima and the belief that Aunt Jemima represents a ready-made history and historical presentation. Brown suggests memorabilia sustains a relation to slavery by allowing their owners to deny the present and romanticize the past, to mask its horrors in the pleasantry of objects. But as Brown argues, when inanimate objects do not repress or keep the past at bay for human subjects, they bring about a disruptive feeling of horror into everyday life. This notion of becoming defines for Brown when the object becomes a thing. But what about other examples, such as Winslow Homer's Black Woman near Andersonville, or the mammy in Harper's Weekly, to which Homer may be responding? Or even Mammy Jane in Chestnut's Marrow. Are they easily readable instruments of white interest in collusion with white politics, or possessed by a thingness that discloses a sense of unintelligibility that lies within all persons? The idea of a thing is somewhat akin to how an artist describes interiority, that one's interiority is, especially in times of crisis, innately chaotic, ineffable, mysterious, and destabilizing to oneself and other. Racism and racist ideologies fix and arrest the expressions of individuals and groups by using their racial identity to make sense of them. Racism objectifies people by evacuating what is essentially human about them, their complexity and instability. What I find most compelling about Brown's thing theory is that it brings about an ungraspable aspect of social encounters between persons. Thing theory illuminates intractability. Brown contended that we confront the thingness of objects when they stop working for us. Objects then work for us. My point then is that things are not ever confused with persons. There is no ontological scandal on the point and the quotidian register. Persons are persons. Persons are persons. Yet one thinks about the thingness of a person, one asks about how one perceives that persons, and what he or she cannot know about them is about what they're thinking. Surprisingly, this contemplation does not divulge content, but points to established limitations between human subjects. And in this notion, one is inevitably dealing with a person's thingness. What stifles them, stifles the self from the self and self-other, what lies beyond the grid of intelligibility. Mammies appear to epitomize intelligibility. They symbolize the domestic life of wealthy southern white homes, a tapestry of family life where each is known to the other, and a hierarchical strictures are strictly observed. The mammy is an instrument of white labor and an interest, and whose interest is fully coherent, readable, a dehumanized object of use. Donald Bogle has made a pertinent distinction between two mammies. One uses her fierce independence, while the Aunt Jemima wedges herself into white culture, but is never headstrong. The Southern memorabilia obscures the two, and in one sense they can read against one another. In Marrow, Mammy Jane is an object of white slavery, a vessel for her owner's angst and holder of their secrets. She exemplifies Major Carteret's interest and longs for her deceased white mistress, not her own family, in the last moments of her life. Yet Jane is fiercely independent, a keeper of family secrets, but sometimes a member of the black community, which points to her own variegated social interests. One of the most interesting moments in the novel is when she wishes that she could take Theodore Felix to her good friend, who is a conjure woman. Since taking her to the conjurer is almost impossible, Jane does her own charm work with the conjuring practice that includes a cross and a trinity as part of the symbolism. She conjures on her own. She makes her volition known and has a worldview that, while not that of a black nationalist or a member of the talented 10th for racial uplift, it is clearly her own. Mammy Jane has a friend in the black community, and conjuring defines the link of that friendship. But this connection only lets us know that so much more is unsaid and silenced in this novel. But still, Chestnut marked its presence. The conjure episode can also be read as a window into another field, one off limits to whites. To be clear, Mammy Jane does her conjuring for the health of the child and interest of the Carteret family. But it does tell us, the reader, about her own convictions and beliefs that exceed her master's, her own. That she has her own friends, connections, and beliefs that she keeps in secret, an interior life of prerogatives. She has her own script outside of Major Carteret, outside of the one that Major Carteret authorized her to keep. This script may not have anything to do with a political strategy, but it does not mean it does not have the capacity to be used as such. Jane's world is not fully available, and the desire to know what makes the desire subject to what she is willing to divulge. The desire is subject to what she is willing to tell them. She always maintains a distance, even with the illusion that she is a working object. Her thingness as interiority emerges. Winslow Homer's painting near Andersonville focuses on a black woman emerging from a dwelling with a large white apron and a head wrap that is Mammy-esque. While she is not overtly a smiling Mammy, she appears to be a recently freed slave woman with a red head wrap and a long white apron, looking at something else in the distance as Confederate troops march by. Peter Wood has examined this painting in fascinating detail. Moving from the tension between the United States slavery past and emancipated present, Wood gave the anonymous woman a name, Hagar. Wood has insisted that the woman in Andersonville is not a Mammy at all, and that Homer's painting directly refutes a character in a Harper's Weekly article titled, "Is All Them Yankees That's Passing?" One is supposed to be a freed black woman in a head wrap, and the other is supposed to be a hollow caricature from Southern racists. This Mammy figure in Harper stems from a celebrated culture of Mammy artifacts and commodities where whites market her as a figure of plantation warmth and blacks' overall happiness in the South. She is supposed to lack all the individuality and perspective that Homer's painting communicates. In the Winslow Homer painting, Wood saw serious depth. Wood pondered, what is she thinking and feeling? He asked in different ways, what is going on inside the Georgia woman's head? Wood approached this through constructing a myriad of anti-racist and feminist perspectives on God's recognition, freedom, sexual violence, and the horror and the triumph of black culture to allow Hagar to speak her interior. Yet admittedly, she never does. But Wood's limitations, his myriad of unanswerable questions, do give us a sense that he, the critic, restricts how the woman is permitted to think and speak. I want to stress that the crucial capacity is not what she's thinking, but what Homer's image inspires us to think about what she is thinking. Do critics confront the fact that we cannot know, that her interiority is hers, and unknown to us beyond the fact that she has one? And that in reality, there's so much there that we cannot grasp, and likely that she would not let us know herself either. One can see that racist constructions of mammies are interested in coherent subject-object relations in order to ensure feelings of racial superiority and worldviews that fit normative visions of the South, Old South. Yet the imposition of racist objectness, how we assume to know, really operates more like a thing relation. Thinking the thinghood in a person actually shows how much others, like Major Carteret, want to fabricate blacks as dogs and as property in order to curtail the thingness, incoherency, and intractability of the subject. So that thingness then is not the opposition to personhood, but rather a realization of what we find most frightening and elusive and even unbearable about being and figuring persons. Thus, the unceasing desire to make someone an object is the attempt to rid the person of thingness that actually cannot be removed. And this act of wanting to remove or pretending to remove that which cannot be taken away harbors the undeniable vitality and truth of a person's thingness. The person's thingness constitutes an ontological reality. It is a personal form that we all have. Thus, one could say that, generally speaking, the human we see in things is a definitive gamut of possibilities, a sliding scale of confusions and mystery that the history of social relations subjects, where object relations we may perceive as normative, racial, or objectifying, can be disrupted in a thing relation. It is the thing enigma that is always threatening, lying in wait. What Winslow Homer and the anonymous cartoonist share is a classic reductionism that illuminates the thingness as form of the person by the cartoonist refusing thingness, and Homer's painting making it visible by provoking a host of unanswerable questions. That's a lot. It's going right in my trade book. No, I was kidding. Okay, last section, sorry. Slavery's counterlives. If there is a shadow that haunts me with intrigue and fascination, it is the thing enigma that I try to discover and rediscover in the art stories that feature enslaved Africans. When it comes to the stories of enslavement that we tell and retell, a slave as revolutionary, a slave as dedicated servant, a mammy figure in the aftermath of the Civil War, a gun-toting offspring of Harriet Tubman, can all be stock figures of the imagination, where knowing them, their type, their category of representation, or form of life is to know how they relate to themselves and others. When it comes to how we name and frame and give rubrics to discussions about art by or about enslaved Africans, aren't we still overtly reliant on terms and concepts that indicate slaves' movement toward or away from freedom? When thinking about slave texts and the enslaved Africans they feature, can we have it both ways? Can we frame discussions of slave life and culture in oppositional dyads, like social life and social death, or brutalization and resistance, and still keep the view that radical refusals and unsettling ambivalence in the art of enslaved Africans? This defines so much of slavery studies scholarship, but there is a problem in fully being attentive to both fluidity and definitional categories. What slavery studies has shown before and after the publications of novels like Toni Morrison's Beloved is that scholarship can have complexity and address ambiguity, but still reproduce the interpretive equivalent of a closed system, a claustrophobic back and forth. The late Ira Berlin warned that slavery studies is too full of stock figures of the scholarly imagination. We can have diversity of archive and practice, yet still produce firm frames and binding oppositions, no matter the period and geography. It's not in yours, yours is way better. I think Berlin pointed us to the right direction that scholars have yet to fully take seriously in their approach to slavery and slaves' representations. Berlin wrote, quote, "Knowing that a person is a slave doesn't tell you everything about him or her. and an understanding that a person was a slave was not the end of the story, but the beginning. As I conclude here today, I want to return to Melville's Benito Cereno. The novella contains an answer to moving beyond accepted oppositional rubrics that define slavery studies. Melville shows his readers the significance of not knowing and realizing one's ignorance when it comes to what a slave is thinking or what they may or may not do. In Benito Cereno, Oranda and Benito Cereno, the slave traders are friends. One part of the novella scholars pay little attention to is that Benito Cereno's dearest Oranda, who assures him that he knows his slaves and they are safe to keep on deck without their chains. It is clear that he has every reason to believe that Babo, Atufal, and the other enslaved Africans will not disrupt the voyage and be obedient. He knows their history and psychology and their daily social practices. This is the basis upon which Oranda knows the slaves' thinking as well. But in a bloody mockery of Oranda's certainty, the enslaved Africans revolt. They kill Oranda and they demand their freedom. My point about the novella has less to do with slave resistance or how the slaves performed their own objecthood throughout the text or what made them somehow complicit in their own subjection. What made Oranda so certain about his slaves? What were the social cues and constraint around their thinking and responses? How could he be so confident in their obedience that he would risk his own life on it? Oranda and Benito Cereno are not just wrong about what is inside the revolting Africans' heads. They're wrong about what people can do, what conditions affect them at different times, and that overall social relations are multifaceted and unpredictable. If we take the latter series of possibilities more seriously, it is hard to tarry in what Berlin called slavery studies stock figures of the scholarly imagination. To fully embrace Berlin's foresight, I assume that as we get closer to slaves as individuals or within a complex community, they'll likely exceed any frame or system we can contain them in. With this concept in mind, we can discover, confront, and relay the counter lives of enslaved Africans. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to invite Michael Snediker to come up. Landscape as Essences.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Don't be confused by my butch exterior. I have a tendency toward passing out, and I'm not saying that just to sort of curry sympathy, but this is a way to nip that in the bud. Am I audible, Meredith?
You are.
I'll take this opportunity to say how wonderful it is to see Meredith again, how deeply grateful I am to Jennifer. I admire her work greatly. You're lucky to have her as a teacher and citizen. Delighted also, with a wink toward tomorrow, to dear Laura Mullen and Cole Swenson and so many others. But mostly for today, the pleasure of being here with Chris is really moving and sweet and happy. So thank you, Chris, for your pages and your presence. So this talk was supposed to be about Judith Butler and Thoreau, but now it's about Eve Sedgwick and Thoreau. The Judith Butler part of this project is forthcoming in differences, so be on the lookout. The real thing to look forward to is a short sort of reading of White Lotus in the Judith Butler pages. If you've ever wondered what Judith Butler plus Jennifer Coolidge would look like, it's there. So this is still called Landscape as Esquisses, and it begins with a short epigraph from Thoreau's Week on the Concord in Merrimack. Thoreau writes, "I have seen a bunch of violets in a glass vase, tied loosely with a straw, which reminded me of myself. Within the grab bag of a closeted childhood's trousseau of cathexes, the one that feels closest to Thoreau is the boy's hitherto private delectation over good King Wenceslas, not the king, but the carol. It's cruisy in its way and appropriately melodramatic for a depressive child whose efforts at imagining himself heroically ceded invariably to visions of languishment. The carol begins with the king and his page in a night of snow, deep and crisp and even. The king's Stevensian attention to the cruelty of frost is diverted at the end of the first verse by the sight of a man, yonder peasant, gathering firewood. The king and his page decide to trek back to the peasant's home to surprise him, as the song puts it, with flesh and wine. The home's location is described in exhilaratingly exacting weirdness as underneath the mountain, right against the forest fence, by St. Agnes Fountain. And so the king and his page make their way to the mountain, the peasant underworld beneath it. Forth they went, the third verse tells us, repeating, forth they went together. And that word together lodged in the boy's head, not least in terms of foreshadowing the bitter weather with which 2 lines later, together will be made to rhyme. At which point the languishment sets in. The page, we are told, says to the king, sire, the night is darker now, and the wind blows stronger. Fails my heart, I know not how. I can go no longer. I would like to imagine the depressive, closeted child's appreciation here of something like an inverse of enjambment. In the manner of languishing, in other words, the lines seem unable to hold themselves apart, less the performance of dominion or power that young Eve Kosofsky takes as enjambment's lesson, than a kind of faintness or anticipation of faintness, graphically enacted in the linear woos by which the heart fails in response to the wind blown stronger, swooned through semicolon, unless the heart fails in ways it know not how. Even as one can hear I know not how as prophylactic embellishment of being unable to go any longer, further, farther, the way the boy offers his tearfully extenuating account for needing not to attend a Little League game just before the parent asks for an explanation. Although the not knowing buckles for the page in its nest of negatives, not knowing how he can go on, and not knowing how he cannot go on, amounting in the heat of this cold night moment to approximately the same. And it's at this point that the king tells his good page to mark my footsteps, to tread now in them boldly, as though walking in the king's own footprints might keep the page as warm as not being there at all, as though the page, in walking those royal tracks, might find himself of a sudden, for instance, in a song. This is the part, to paraphrase Whitman's 28 Bathers, the closeted boy likes best. Since walking through the snow in tracks made by the king's feet surely amounts to an intimacy only further charged by its ghost-like formalism. This strikes the boy as an improvement over the kitsch of footprints, the Jesus parable he is made to keep on his bedroom wall, where one set of footprints shows the boy where he was carried. In both versions of this fantasy, there is just one set of footprints within the operative frame, though in the carol, the prints made by 2 feet are remade by 2 more. And it is this capacity for repetition, of prints not only didactically left, but recursively inhabited, that feels close to Thoreau's own sensibility, to walking in his tracks. But what if some element of the spiraling organism's fantasy had been about the landscape, the snow, all along? We look at every track in the snow, Thoreau writes in his journal. Every little while there is the track of a fox, maybe the same one, across the river, turning aside sometimes to a muskrat's cabin or a point of ice, and frequently the larger track of a hound, which has followed his trail. Or with terser queerness and absent the dynamic of pursuit evinced by the hound, I followed on this fox's trail so long that my thoughts grew foxy. Gotta love Henry. The tracks that turn Walden and Thoreau's journal into pentimenti are as often pondered, however, as aseemic marks, affording encounters with an aesthetic autonomizing, recalling Thoreau's assertion of the echo as an original sound, the same trivial words and notes sung by a wood nymph. His response to the tracks of others, the charm of his own writing as implicit extension of the inscriptions, human and non-human, that precede him, tend toward wonder, as when he writes of having seen on the surface of the Walden ice great sweeping, waving lines, somewhat like these. It is the track of the wind, the impress which it makes on flowing materials. And toward the pleasures of misrecognition, what Eve Sedgwick might conceptualize within the rubric of surprise, as when Thoreau mistakes the dimpling, welling surface of the pond for rain, when the effervescing, in fact, registers the darting movement of a school of perch. The sheer profligacy of these ubiquitously surfacing and vanishing tracks contrasts starkly with the massive and immovable track of the railroad, looming as it does through Thoreau's pages as emblem of our own tendency to reduce relational mobility, erotically and otherwise, as though we could tell these things apart, to a single groove. Indeed, that we have winnowed both the queerness of our resistance to the world and our habits of articulating the truth of that queerness to a set of indurated and mimetically fail-proof moves, is what Eve Sedgwick's critique of paranoid reading most stringently takes to task. And because Sedgwick can't resist the Jamesian titillation of retracing her own prior steps, the critique most plaintively emerges from her sense of having laid much of the groundwork for this mimicry herself, as though the exposure of excruciation or exclusion could be danced with heuristically mapped patterns of feet on the floor. Some version of this evacuated theatrics has always informed my sense of the subtitle, "You're so paranoid, you probably think this essay's about you." Sedgwick's riff on Carly Simon's deeply catchy, self-aggrandizing song about someone else's self-aggrandizement is all too easy for us to tap into, to wear as our own. Love is formalism, and our criticism is karaoke. And yet the image that presides for me over Sedgwick's work, which prompts much of my recent writing, is epistemology of the closet's reckoning of the calibratively wayward force of rhetorical effects, in terms, Sedgwick writes, of the exaggerated propulsiveness of wearing flippers in a swimming pool. The formulation poses a striking alternative to a closet's rectilinear architecture, as our initial delight in the tableau's flamboyant awkwardness gives way to a hallucinated attention not only to the initial propulsiveness, but to the wake in the pool that the propulsive movement makes. As indicated by the above remarks, I've been returning to, thinking about, the work of Sedgwick's work in advance of this visit in relation to that of Thoreau, specifically how the materialist or materializing dilations of Sedgwick's critical idiom and the figurative errancy of Thoreau's attentional capacities meet each other more or less halfway. That the site of relationality, or at least the site of this relationality, has come to seem imaginable for me in terms of the converging of figuration as it tends toward materiality, and materiality as it tends toward figuration, is something I'm better able to articulate since writing Contingent Figure, Chronic Pain and Queer Embodiment. Although Contingent Figure was always about chronic pain, if by about we mean the ecological density through which the fretwork of Contingent Figure's readings variously shuttle, its original subtitle was Aesthetic Duress from Emerson to Sedgwick. Duress, like a field internal to a name, tried to speak etymologically to or from experiences of imperviousness over time, contingency ossifying against itself in us. How could this encounter with so intransigent a substance, not quite a substance, and even less an object, not incessantly circuit as an aesthetic phenomenon? On the one hand, I was drawn to the idiom of being or living under duress as it bears on how chronic pain comes to be felt, as though living in a body, a quotidian curtailed by pain, to which one answered because it wouldn't answer you, amounted to an unwieldy and eventually attritive experience of constraint or compromise. I should say here parenthetically, there's just on the one hand, no other hand, and that's an homage to Melanie Klein, who has this weird tick of invoking on the one hand and then forgetting about it. Close parenthetical, lest you think I'm losing my mind in that way. As Thoreau writes in his journal in somewhat like-minded spirit, man's relation to oxen is the same that it was in primitive ages. It is equally primitive. He has got no nearer to them. If his ox breaks through the ice, he knows no better how to get him out than if it had never happened. The helpless unwieldiness of the oxen is remarkable. Before attending to the particularity of these lines, it behooves us to recall certain aspects of Thoreau's journal as a textual enterprise. The phenomenological quality of the entries and excerpts of entries such as this one bears the impress of journal writing as a genre, as Sharon Cameron suggests, of randomness. The entries are galvanized by their flotational status, their suspensive freedom from constraints of plot, argument, or context. Although sometimes we may be tempted to characterize Thoreau's speculations as observations, the journals no less unsettle the question of what is being observed, other than a quality of mind so deeply inflected by its surroundings that thinking and perception, claim and context, prove all but interchangeable. Sometimes, for example, what begins as empirical observation quickly finds itself subsumed by the dilative embellishment it occasions, until the latter gives rise to further speculation or alights, however briefly, on some other local phenomenon. A cow in the meadow with a new dropped calf by her side, or the sweet fern losing its leaves that seems capable of disappearing, sorry, I missed my quotation marks, or the sweet fern losing its leaves, close quote, that seems capable of disappearing into reveries of hypothesis, whether it does or not. The journal, that is, posits the new dropped calf or sweet fern as potentially figurative, which is to say, neither quite literal nor figurative at all. The vibrant instability of the journal's attention both learns from, and indeed is responsible for, the diffuse indeterminacies it responsively traces. Lee Edelman's early study of Hart Crane, Transmemberment of Song, conceptualizes this particular animacy in Crane's poems in terms of catachresis, whereby the infrastructure holding figurative and literal sense, both together and apart, at once disintegrates what it repairs and vice versa. This is the force of Paul de Man's suggestion that within such a catachrestic universe, one begins to perceive a world of potential ghosts. Quote. Cameron's account of Thoreau strains toward the catachrestic as well, imagining the journal, quote, not simply as a figure of speech in which a word violates a context by its unconventional habitation there, but metaleptically metaphorized, so it could also apply to the journal's 47 manuscript volumes. And when Barbara Johnson invokes catachresis in relation to the unsteadying homelessness of Walden's most vibrant terms, it is to illuminate their belonging, as she puts it, to a world of homely figurative richness, yet the impersonal literality they seem to presuppose is nowhere to be found, quote. Thoreau makes us see, Johnson continues, that every lost object is always, in a sense, catachresis, a figurative substitute for nothing that ever could be literal, quote. And so we return to the scene of a man on the verge of losing his ox, the proleptic ghostliness of which surely informs the pathos of Thoreau's assertion that he has got no nearer to them, echoing as the latter does the devastating unwieldiness of Emerson's claim and experience that in the death of my son, now more than 2 years ago, I seem to have lost a beautiful estate. No more. I cannot get it near to me. Whether or not the burden borne by the ox is its own, the weight of the unbearable that the ox in turn becomes hard to distinguish from the person, the self, nominally responsible for it. This relation, Thoreau observes, is a primitive one, a term for Thoreau as much as for Freud or Melanie Klein, excuse me, that marks the structure of a wish for reactualizing a wildness in ourselves, for which, quote, the bog in our brain and bowels, the primitive vigor of nature in us, as Thoreau writes, continues, however strandedly, to pine. And when Thoreau repeats the word primitive, when a relation unchanged from what it was in primitive ages becomes simply equally primitive, there's a sense that this it has come to refer not only to the relation, but also to the man, as though we were as primitive as the ox whose helplessness we can only watch. Am I losing my voice, kids? Let's see if this works. This solves all problems. The universal solvent, that's right. Okay. Okay, that marks the structure of a wish for reactualizing the wildness in ourselves, for which, quote, the bog in our brain and bowels, the primitive vigor of nature in us, as Thoreau writes, continues, however strandedly, to pine. And when Thoreau repeats the word primitive, when a relation unchanged from what it was in primitive ages becomes simply equally primitive, there's a sense that this it has come to refer not only to the relation, but also to the man, as though we were as primitive as the ox whose helplessness we can only watch. Though Thoreau's tribute to the ox is stranger even than it initially appears, in the paragraph, this is dreadful, preceding the lines I quoted, it's like a second puberty, preceding the lines I quoted, Thoreau writes that, quote, oxen, which are de-animalized to some extent, approach nearer the vegetable than bulls and cows. Nothing more natural than that the deer should appear with a tree growing out of his head. Thus is the animal allied to the vegetable kingdom and passes into it by insensible degrees. Quote, we may say of Thoreau's ox what Spiros Papapetros observes in regard to Abby Warburg's fascination with the Daphne figure, that, quote, it is never precisely a subject or an object, but a field of spatio-temporal extension. Primitive, then, names for Thoreau a prior ecological attunement before the ecological more pointedly indicated what lay external to us. Before the soul, as Antonio Birnbaum writes in homage to Jean-Luc Nancy, determined exteriority by exempting itself from everything that rendered it present to the inside of the world. The distilled scene of man and ox and ice thus replays a pang commensurate with, if not what we feel incessantly inside us. Do you want to read the rest for me?
I'm happy
I
to.
feel like this must be torturous for you.
I mean, if it's hurting your voice, I'm happy to.
I'd rather your attention be on the words instead
Okay.
of like whatever this has become.
Okay, show me where you are.
appreciate it.
Okay, forgive my stumbling over Michael's amazing words.
Please thank Jennifer for
Okay,
pitching in.
I'll maybe start at the end.
Okay.
And
Take
just,
your walkers if you want
Okay.
to.
I'm going to start at the beginning of the
Okay.
paragraph. Primitive, then, names for Thoreau a prior ecological attunement before the ecological more pointedly indicate what lay external to us, before the soul, as Antonia Birnbaum writes in homage to Jean Nancy. Quote, determined exteriority by exempting itself from everything that rendered it present to the inside of the world. The distilled scene of man and ox and ice thus replays a pang commensurate with, if not what we feel incessantly inside us, then a feeling that persists there, whether we are able to apprise it or not, which is to say felt, between the brain and the bog reduced to the brain's inner residuum, as the agitation of interiority's sensation of having been, if not being, something or somewhere else. Emerson, too, is drawn to this meditative field where attunement comes to rest on such richly tautological sites of attunement, as when the charm of a January sunset seems to replay as skywriting, our inner theater of fragmentation, quote, the western clouds dividing and subdividing themselves into pink flakes modulated with tints of unspeakable softness, leading Emerson to ponder the pain of, quote, coming within doors when the air had so much life and sweetness. If the softness that modulates the pink flakes of clouds feels unspeakable, what it was that nature would say, Emerson subjunctively asks, it remains generatively unclear as to whether Emerson himself is unable to find language equal to the softness, or whether the expressive softness speaks a cloud language that eludes even Emerson's most anguished translative mode. Hence Emerson's Laplanchian sense of the sunset's mute music, of being pervaded by a song so removed from the understandable as to seem impossible within the terms of the world that it colors. The oniric aspect of Emerson's wistful skyward tether, left holding the string whilst scanning the dwindling balloon, like the near grammatical distillation of Thoreau's Lascaux-like ox, suggests the extent to which these scenes are held as a kind of memory shorn equally from what Melville calls the gadding world, named, the OED surmises, from the gad stick used to drive an ox, and the non-gadding substance we are and can't remember, which we try from within this approximately mnemic or auto-haunted stirring to recall. Our distance from even the memory of this spatial pathos is keenly felt to the degree that we find ourselves in every aspect of our overmanaged, under-supported lives, doing more with less, to have been believed into the very strategies of fortitude from which this rue precipitates as a kind of alien promissory reliquary of affect. The experiment of Walden, and the more lavishly indigestible enterprise of the journal, from which Walden, in at least a partial sense, is culled, is committed to expanding the surface of encounter within which such pangs occur. Since forging a relational practice to these habits of dislodgement depends on experiencing the wistfulness often enough as to acquire a feel for its quotidian beyond the self-defensive shellac of acclimatation, to live long enough within this seriality should the whist drift past its own vestige, the slow of its protocol. In the closing pages of On the Inconvenience of Other People, Lauren Berlant reflects on the challenge of, quote, being and writing with unbearable objects, not by becoming hard like them or soft in empathic compensation, but by loosening them up and becoming loose with them, if not like them. Object looseness isn't captured by representation because it's a moving condition. This aeration of ourselves, our objects, and even the vinculum, as Deleuze might put it, by which we are only somewhat held umbilically in place, reminds us that the field of object relations is a field, and that Thoreau writes that oxen, which are de-animalized to some extent, approach nearer the vegetable than bulls and cows. Nothing more natural than that the deer should appear with a tree growing out of it. I did a thing. I'm sorry. And that, because I printed on both sides, my fault, reminds us that the field of object relations is a field, and that each object, not least the ones we are, at best names an ecotone's complex system of erosion and accretion. Even the nearness of Berlant's formulation, object looseness, to the idiom of object lesson, enacts a version of this lesson in looseness, as though the latter's vowels and consonants enacted the former's denser fibers teased apart. Although Sedgwick tells us in A Dialogue on Love that the wasteful self has a big, loose footprint like a messy hurricane, end quote, Michael is as inclined to think this almost impossible collation of form and contingency articulates rather what the self is. The looseness of being the looseness of being opens onto aspects of virtuality perceptible in Sedgwick's writing from the start. At the heart of epistemology of the closet, notwithstanding the closet's ostensible toggling between open and closed, is the ravishment, not of what can't be articulated, but what hasn't been articulated. And in the middle distance between the two, Sedgwick's closet becomes an ambivalent and ardent figure for the pathos, the desire of possibility itself. Potential, Agamben writes, quote, isn't something not real that precedes the act in which it is realized. It is, on the contrary, the only way in which we can have what we do, end quote. A version of this premise informs Dickinson's assertion that, quote, I dwell in possibility rather than on it, as though possibility were less a discrete object for lyricizing than the landscape itself. Which is to say, this lesson in looseness is vital to the rehearsal in Thoreau and Sedgwick, to name just two of the authors at hand, of landscape as itself a way of being. Michael will leave you with just two more passages. Paesaggio in Italian, the word for landscape. The first, from Sedgwick's Tendencies, posits a keenly performative gesture of divestment, one of many sites in the mid-Sedgwick canon where we feel a shift, an effort at shifting, something akin to Prospero's abjuring of rough magic. Part of what I want to see, Sedgwick writes, is what's to be learned from turning this experience of dealing with cancer in all of its and my marked historical specificity, and with all the uncircumscribableness of the turbulence and threat involved, back towards a confrontation with the theoretical models that have helped me make sense of the world so far. The phenomenology of life-threatening illness, the performativity of a life threatened relatively early on by illness, the recent crystallization of a politics explicitly oriented around grave illness, exploring these connections has, at least for me it has, to mean hurling my energies outward to inhabit the very farthest of the loose ends where representation, identity, gender, sexuality, and the body can't be made to line up neatly together, end quote. Years before the weather improves, the turning of experience, the turning back of the turbulence that experience can't circumscribe, the turning back of this uncircumscribableness towards a confrontation with one's extant theoretical models suggests that it isn't simply a reparative mode by which the legacy of paranoid reading will be remediated. Rather, this mode of, quote, being and writing with the unbearable arrives on the earlier scene like a weather front, or at least however much of weather the new writing can muster, quote, hurling my energies outward to inhabit the farthest of the loose ends, quote, when one's life of dwelling goes off into the distance, to borrow from a Bauman's translation of Holderlin. And here again is Thoreau. A steady onward motion I feel in me, as still as that, or like some vast snowy cloud whose shadow first is seen across the fields. It is the material of all things loose and set afloat that makes my sea. Thank you. How do you, do you want to take a question? You like a little?
This is like a disability theory in action.
Well, but there's something about the power of the words. I started to like get scratchy and froggy as I'm reading.
So it's a cursed paper.
No, it's not a cursed paper. There's something. So I'd like to open things up. First of all, thank you both so much. I so much is flying around my head, and I'm like trying to put things together on the fly. But I'm going to open it up to questions first, rather than like monopolizing the floor.
You could try pressing buttons on that, like.
Yes, you don't have to shout.
Michael, do you want a coffee?
Yes, he does want one. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Wait, where was it? Hot Crop 15.
I'm gonna just like run up
Just
in the
wanted to see
middle
how
on
bad I
this
would
creepy
get.
phone.
Thank you,
Okay,
darling.
well, it's just blinking red, and I don't know how to make it work.
You can go.
I did, for now.
Thank you, Judith. Anything? Yes, Laura.
Okay, Michael, it's for you. There was a moment that slipped by me, and I'm not quite sure what happened to it.
Okay.
But it was the moment where you mentioned the railroad, and then it went past so quickly. Did I miss something in that transition? I couldn't help but be attentive to it because of Christopher Freeburg being here and thinking about Ahab using the railroad as his way of describing his inability
That's right.
to learn from or change.
No, that's a really smart connection, Laura. And in the longer version of these pages, a little more dilation happens in that moment. But at the same time, the compression of the moment in the text is itself, I think, an enactment of this sort of catachresis by which the railroad almost too quickly becomes something metaphorical, such that within the passage, we're thinking about railroads the way Thoreau is thinking about railroads. And they simply do, within the pages, too quickly become something like a model for binary thinking. You're either going this way or you're going that way. What's interesting in the journal, actually, is the railroad becomes part of the landscape in a way that Thoreau is more interested in the flowers that grow around the tracks more than he is in sort of didactically pontificating about the railroad itself. But at the same time, the more one follows the sheer multiplicity of tracks, bird prints, fox prints, etc., the more lame the railroad seems as sort of its own literalization of what a track is. So within the pages, at least, you didn't miss anything. It's a relatively fast pivot, for the sake of time, from something like the landscape of Concord, Massachusetts, to the very model of ossified thinking that Sedgwick is so allergic to in Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
But I love the Ahab connection.
Can I ask you just a follow-up? Why do we like railroads so much?
There are a lot of reasons.
I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is not, you said not,
Yeah.
it's not really a sociological question, but I mean, like,
No,
you know.
I think, well, I can only speak from my experience of liking railroads. And one of the things that is so magical about them, for instance, and I grew up in the East Coast, so usually railroads would take me by bodies of the Atlantic. And there's something really amazing about the disorientation of seeing a landscape pass faster than you can hold on to it. And that becomes its own model of like object relations on the fritz. It's the pleasure of not being able to grasp something. So in that sense, the pleasure of a railroad becomes its own version of sort of depersonalization. There's no way, for instance, to feel like a subject in the good capital S sense, when one is just sitting there, like it's a version of passivity. But also, if you're lucky enough to be on sort of a beautiful railroad route, it's the experience of passivity as relates to something like you pouring into the landscape and vice versa. So that's just, why do you like railroads? This is like a first date question.
Well, no, no. I was just thinking about the question of ossified thinking or monomaniacal thinking, and I feel like it really is. I was really positing more of a relation, which is that we don't think that we like railroads, but like we want to sound more like the journal, but we really, it's I think that's partly your point though, that we're embattled and stretched between in a way, but at the same time I feel like there's this where we kind of in our postmodern sensibilities or way that we really understand that we'd like to be. We're positing one thing, but I guess I'm kind of saying, like, are we really more like kind of Ahab in some ways, or more like him than we want to be?
And we secretly still want to be like Ahab. Like there's something really sort of intellectually exciting about that drive, just to think about the rhetoric of sort of vehicularity in relation to like moving around. But the railroad also feels like a version of sort of powerlessness that we can get behind. Like, unless we're driving the railroad, we really are sitting there beholden on someone else, beholden to someone else. But also it's the difference, just to go back to Thoreau, between a route and a path. There's a way in which the route can only go so many ways. You either follow it or you don't. Whereas Walden, and not to sort of turn it into some sort of like schlock lesson, but there's so many more paths than just two. So good follow-up.
I love it.
Yes, thank you both so much for your talks. This question may be entirely wrong, but it is for Chris Freeburg. And I really love the idea of thingness as an alternate to the subject-object binding. It's a kind of objection, but it also seems to possibly be like a path towards interiority. And that makes me think of like problems with fetish and how, like, at least in sexuality studies, you can be attracted to like this, somebody's form, and that can be objectionable, or that can be like a path towards greater intimacy. And I'm just hoping that you talk more about the difference between objecthood and thingness. And I would love to hear that.
I mean, I think I'll maybe just turn back to how I started thinking about it. I think this is it might be available throughout kind of Bill Brown, he I think has come back to what I'm trying to say. I think he expanded upon it, but what I thought about, like, when he would talk about the thingness of something, or the thing being something that disrupts subject-object relations, in my head I was always like, well, if we see, like, in terms of repetition, does that thing, do we now expect the thing to do the thing again? So then doesn't it become an object? So like, how long is it a thing? It seems like to me that we want to keep arresting things in a way of making sense out of them, and so they become objects again. And so I thought about that in terms of race, like, in terms of like how really, I'm thinking a lot about Baldwin the whole time, because Baldwin hates categories, but at the same time, categories can help us too. But when we overly cling to them, they can do terrible things. And so that was why I thought about the thingness of persons being something that people always, I feel like this is kind of like a wisdom moment in my life where people always continue to surprise me. Like I go into my black barbershop with my son, and I'm thinking like, I just come back from the California beaches, and I've got this videotape of elephant seals. And I'm thinking, nobody gives a shit about elephant seals in this black barbershop because we talk about sports, we talk about politics, talk whatever it is. And I go there and I'm playing around with it, this video. And next thing you know, everybody in the barbershop is talking about my video. I'm like, let me see that. Where did you see that? Let me see that. What are those? I mean, like, and I guess I'm trying to say, I know that I guess my point is it really may not actually be about them. It was more about me. But it was about me being kind of like, what the hell? Elephant seals are taking over the barbershop.
Mm-hmm.
I would have never thought that my video of elephant seals would take, or people interested, little kids like, yeah, coming around. But, so I guess my point would be is that I found that to the part of me who would think no one would care about that was the person who had figured out the room already.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I don't want to have the room. I want to have to go against the idea of having this room figured out. So I guess for me, that's the thingness of persons versus the object. I don't know how stable that is. It's like I just said. I don't know if like those terms ultimately, I feel like Michael could all tear it all down because it's a poof. But that's how I was thinking. That's how I was thinking about it. And last thing I'll say is when I remember listening to, I thought Peter Wood actually had a really brilliant lecture on that Homer Winslow painting. But I remember when he kept talking about what the woman was thinking, I was like, why would she, like actually I thought about how much I loved what he was saying actually about what the woman was thinking. And then I was thinking about, wait a minute, why would she be thinking that necessarily? These all seem like they've come right out of, like he had read Patricia Hill Collins or he had read Black Feminists, and he was like, oh, this is what they want her to be thinking about, whether that's true or not. And I was like, she could be thinking about a million different things. Then I thought like the victory was me thinking that. I don't know what she could be thinking. She could be thinking some very practical things about, I have no idea. And I thought having no idea, I was like, that's what I want to have. I want to have no idea, or whatever. So I don't know if that helps.
I also wonder to what extent, bracketing like Bill's sort of excellent work on thing theory, to what extent thingness just ends up becoming, it's a big deal, becomes a version of the unconscious, whether one thinks about it in terms of Das Ding or otherwise. There's this amazing new book on the British psychoanalyst Winnicott that just came out by Christopher Bollas, another brilliant psychoanalyst. And in the opening pages, he's thinking about something called fetal life, which is to say, for psychoanalysis, when sort of like the fetus has yet been given birth, there is no sense of subject and object. Unconscious itself barely makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But something like thingness seems really helpful there as an experience, for better or for worse, that precedes something like the grid of object relations as we imagine it grammatically. And in that sense, if we think about it in relation to an unconscious, it takes me back to some of like Lauren Berland's brilliant work on glitches or losing our balance socially, or even something like Bartleby's utterance or Billy Budd's stutter. These things that throw people off guard have a way, if not of reorienting us to the world, and sort of salubriously disorienting us to them. And thingness there becomes sort of a placeholder before things tragically become subjects or objects again. Like if only we could hold on to thingness, to go back to your sense of it, if only we could hold onto thingness long enough before it sort of became something legible. But how we do that is a whole other question.
And I wonder if your notion of cloud language is a place
Yes.
you can hold on before the concept evolves, which also I think like speaks in general to this like new anti-frame, Chris, that you were talking about slave narratives, like how these new anti-frame, the anti-frame, or like you didn't quite put it that way, but the new type of frame that has yet to be conceived of. Is thingness a kind of incomplete possibility like cloud language?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for your observations. They resonate with my attachments to clouds in these texts. For instance, we're always sort of impulsively trying to find shapes in clouds, and that both suggests sort of like the wonder and